Today I wanted to talk a little bit about terminology. As a funeral director and having been in the funeral service profession for so many years, terminology becomes a bit of an awkward thing for people. They have a hard time trying to discern whether or not they're dealing with a funeral or calling hours or a wake or whatever they happen to use to describe what we do. And because of that, I thought it might take some time to discuss terminology of funeral service. Nothing fancy here, just a few notes on the board, but to talk a little bit about what some of the terms are that people use. And of course, everybody knows about funerals, and people will say that they hate going to funerals, or that funerals, they had a funeral that was really perfect for their parent or their loved one, and that's pretty typically the terminology that you'll hear people talk about when they're talking about dealing with a death and what happens after someone passes away and what they go through. Now, a wake, on the other hand, some people will come to me and say, well, Joe, I don't want a funeral. What I want is a wake. And I'll go, okay. And can you explain to me what you mean when you say you want a wake? Well, I want a wake. I want a party. What I want to do is I want to have a party. I don't want to have something sad. I've had good friends that said that. He said, you can have a little funeral for me, but really what I want is a wake. So when it's over, I want a party. So that term comes in a lot, that, I want a wake, or I was at a wake. And sometimes it's actually a term that comes into play because of where someone lives. It's almost geographic. When it comes to calling hours, most people are familiar with that. In this area, they call calling hours when you have a time before a funeral when people can come in and talk to the family, talk to the relatives, and visit. But the word calling hours a lot of times scares people, because when they think calling hours, if they've been around this planet very long, they think back years ago and they think, my gosh, 3 days of calling hours before the funeral. 2 to 4, 7 to 9, 3 days. And that scares people. A lot of people say, I just don't want those calling hours. And it's because they're thinking it's going to be long and drawn out. Most of the time now, calling hours are going to simply be one evening or an afternoon, perhaps going into evening. And that's usually it. And maybe a little bit just before a service. But they're not usually 3 days anymore. You'll also hear the term visitation used when talking about calling hours. And again, that's always sort of awkward because, again, who are you visiting? I mean, you're visiting the family. Certainly, the family's there, and you're coming to pay your respects to that family and acknowledge their loss. But, that's another term that's sort of used the same as calling hours. Now, a lot of people will say, I don't want a funeral, I prefer to have a memorial service. And a lot of times they say a memorial service, and what they're thinking is when they use that term that there will be no body present. There will be, sharing memories. It'll be talking about the person, but without the body present. But in all respects, a memorial service is a funeral. It's just a different way of looking at it. It's a different type of terminology. Some people now talk about they want a celebration of life. And certainly I can understand that and why that gives some comfort, some solace to people to celebrate the fact that someone has lived their life and they're now passed on. But it can be difficult to celebrate sometimes. Certainly we all know situations where there's absolutely no celebration involved. It's extremely difficult to deal with, but it's a term that does get used. But what's true is that if you look at these terms and how I sort of describe them over here in some of my notes, they're components of each other. No matter what you call them, they sort of go back and forth, and they're all pretty much the same. And I think people get caught up sometimes in the terminology that's being used. And if we swing over here, I think the key thing to remember, and this comes from experience and dealing with families and talking to people over the years, is that there's an acknowledgement of loss. No matter what you do, in one way or another, you're going to acknowledge the loss, because that is truly what's important. It's really how healing can begin. And so that's why all of these things are important, no matter what you call them.